So thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. It really is an honor to be at the National University of Singapore, which is an institution for which I and my colleagues in Oxford have the greatest respect and admiration. And I come to this great university from another on the other side of the planet, but with which you have a long-established partnership in research through the International Alliance of Research Universities and through your study abroad program. And before I came here, I did a little bit of research on the connections, and turns out that as of last December, there were over 400 Singaporean students in Oxford, one of the largest groups of international students at the university. And through the Students' Association, they make a really big contribution to the student life of the university. And so to be able to visit this country, it's my first time in your beautiful country and this university to talk about a subject of equal importance to both of our countries, and each of our institutions is a really wonderful gift, so thank you. So my own department for continuing education traces its history back quite a bit further to 1878, when the first extension lecture was delivered there, and the intention at that time was to provide opportunities for people who are otherwise unable to take advantage of Oxford's rich academic resources, to access those through lectures and classes given by university academics in towns across the country and through residential summer schools in the city. And since then, that department has an unbroken history, albeit with very different institutional configurations, and enrolls about 16 to 18,000 students a year on programs that range from doctorates through taught master's degrees, undergraduate diplomas, open access courses, and continuing professional development. Scale's history is perhaps a little bit shorter as far as I understand it, and its mission and vision, which I've put up here next to ours, rather different. Since its inception in 2016, I think that's correct, and aligning with Singapore's Skills Future initiative, it's aimed to deliver Singapore's ambitions to promote a culture of lifelong learning and skills development that will enable learners to realize their full potential in a way that's aligned with global trends and the needs and expectations of industry and the market. What unites us, despite differences that are largely a product of history and the place of our respective universities in our national educational infrastructures, perhaps, is a strong and shared commitment to and belief in the value of enabling all those who can benefit from education to access it, whoever they are, wherever they're from, and whatever their circumstances and ambition may be. So while our Department for Continuing Education in Oxford is still very much focused on academic provision across the full range of core humanities and social sciences, and Scale is, again, maybe I'll be corrected, but from what I could see, more explicitly attentive perhaps to career development, a resilient and adaptable workforce, and the ambitions of Singapore's Smart Nation agenda, we both recognize, I think, the value and importance of providing learning opportunities for people able and willing to take advantage of those opportunities, and of minimizing barriers to access. And that's really what I want to talk about today. Our respective countries and our institutions recognize the importance of access to lifelong learning and continuing education, and are addressing it in ways that are responsive to and appropriate to our local and national contexts. Importantly, though, we're privileged to live, and I think this is really critical, came up a lot in Yunlei's extraordinary video about that village in China, which I'm going to remember, I think, for the rest of my life as a really extraordinary moment. We are living in developed economies where we choose to do so, allocate resources to education and training through multimodal provision, which makes it accessible to learners. Elsewhere across the world, however, significant challenges and disparities remain. And addressing these along with identifying and implementing solutions is necessary for reasons that are at the same time economic, social, and ethical. So what I want to talk about today is structured like this. I want to remind us why adult learning and education, or ALE, is so important and why solutions to the challenges we face in ensuring equitable provision are vital. Second, I want to spend a little time on the global economic and demographic context and the challenges we face across the world in securing equitable access. Thirdly, I'm going to look at some of the specific challenges as they relate to particular populations and in the means of delivering adult learning opportunities in an increasingly digitized world. And finally, I'm going to suggest ways perhaps in which we can work towards finding solutions to these challenges in our own particular contexts. And I just want to start, before I do that, to, again, everybody seems to be doing it today. It might seem odd for somebody who's giving a lecture about global challenges in accessing lifelong learning to say, I'm not an expert. Maybe we're all going to say that today, and you'll be thinking you want your money back. But I wouldn't say I'm an expert. What I am an expert in is 35 years of teaching, about 25 years of which have been focused on teaching adult learners in my own experience in Birkbeck and at the Open University in the UK, as well as in lifelong learning contexts in Oxford. And I think that's really important because you're not going to get from me a lecture about andragogy or adult learning from that perspective, but perhaps a broader context based on a lot of institutional experience of working in a university sector in the UK. So why is adult learning so important? We are living in a world of climate change, of demographic shifts, voluntary and forced migration, pandemic disease, labour market transitions, and developments in information and communication technologies, the potential for which and long-term impact of which we can only imagine. Adult learning and education, as the 2009 Belém Framework for Action, which was drafted under the aegis of UNESCO, explains, plays a critical role in responding to these and other trends. While our increasingly connected planet means that we can learn in new and exciting ways, drawing on cultures, epistemologies, and ways of seeing which are different from our own, the profound inequalities that exist between and among nations and regions, which are most starkly apparent between the advanced economies of the global north and the developing economies in the global south, which is seen on this map, showing the distribution of those economies as classified by the World Bank, mean not only that this potential is harder to realize, but access to opportunities that will contribute to its realization is significantly limited. Many millions of our fellow human beings, a large proportion of whom are subsisting in conditions of absolute or relative poverty, lack the most basic literacy and life skills and have been denied or don't even have access to primary education. In such a world, the economic growth needed to lift these people out of poverty and the countries in which they live fully to participate in and on an equal footing with others depends on the provision of high quality, sustainable, and effectively financed education throughout the life course for all citizens, whatever their age and personal circumstances. And of course, it's not just economic prosperity that adult learning and education, or ALE, supports. It's vital for personal development, for helping to build the self-confidence of individuals and to improve their physical and mental health and well-being, and to promote and secure cohesion at a community and population level. So these themes were amplified and developed at the 7th International Conference on Adult Education, or Confintea, in Marrakesh, just 2 years ago in 2022, taking place, importantly, during the COVID-19 pandemic. The representatives of the 142 member states of UNESCO emphasized its structural impact and the need to develop and implement educational strategies that would enable people effectively to manage its effects, the effects of the pandemic. And the Marrakesh Framework for Action, which was called Harnessing the Transformative Power of Adult Education and Learning, also emphasizes the fact that ALE is critical for the delivery not only of Sustainable Development Goal 4, through which member states are committed to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, but all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Further affirming the findings of the International Commission on the Futures of Education, which reported the previous year in 2021, the Marrakesh Framework recognizes that education is a fundamental human right, that ALE is critical in delivering gender equality, and that in achieving this, adult learning must be, and I quote, comprehensive, holistic, and intergenerational, bringing together education actors with sectors such as health, protection, and justice. And more generally, but no less powerfully, it asserts this. At a time when societies are threatened by rising fanaticism and violent extremism, growing distrust in science and rising inequalities within and between countries, we reaffirm that adult learning and education, ALE, can constitute a powerful policy response to consolidate social cohesion, enhance socio-emotional skill development, secure peace, strengthen democracy, improve cultural understanding, eliminate all types of discrimination, and promote peaceful living together and active and global citizenship. And if we're involved in that, no wonder we are tired, I think, because these are very grand claims, aren't they? But they are ones which I'm sure those of us attending this symposium may, at least in principle, identify with and reflect perhaps on Yunlei's suggestion, how do we know we've done enough? The challenge that confronts us, of course, is that even if, it's a big ask, even if ALE can constitute such a response, the context in which that response has to be delivered by governments and by their partners in the public and private sector is extremely challenging. And that's what I want to turn to now, the global economic and demographic context in which we're supposed to be delivering this extraordinary set of outcomes. We live in a world of significant economic wealth disparity between and within countries. That disparity, which existed before the COVID-19 pandemic and which has been amplified by its effects, is most obviously apparent between the global south and north and within countries in those situated in sub-Saharan Africa and South America. There are, however, no countries or regions in which the impact of disparity isn't felt, and we can see this in maps that show the classification of countries by income, by the percentage of those with the most wealth and income, and by the national average income and GDP. So, as of 2022, a couple of years ago now, but I don't think it's changed that much, according to the World Inequality Report, 10% of the world's population owned 76% of the world's wealth and took 52% of its income. In contrast, the poorest half of the population earned 8.5% of it and owned 2% of the wealth. The global disparity is also apparent within countries. In some high-income countries, such as the United States, inequality is great, and in others, such as Sweden, it's low. Similarly, some low and middle-income countries, such as India, are very unequal, and in others, this is less marked. As between regions, inequality varies significantly, with MENA the Middle East and North Africa, there we go, being the most unequal as regards income, and Europe the least. And if you look at this slide here, you can see that Latin America and MENA are the most unequal as regards capital wealth distribution. And of course, it's not only between and within countries and regions that there is this disparity. This exists as between men and women. Gender parity in earnings would mean that women earned 50% of all income from work, and yet since 1990, when it was 30%, it rose to the staggering figure of 35% in 2020. So in those 30 years, there had been just a 5% increase. While there's been a narrowing in some regions, it has remained relatively static in most and even worsened in some. Along with the fact that, sorry, I should have shown you that, that's the female labour income share across the world. Along with the fact that recent years have seen a 50% reduction in growth in emerging market and developing economies from a high point in the years 2005 to 9 to just over 6%, from just over 6% to just over 3% between 2020 and 24. And it should be apparent that the economic context in which we are looking to ensure equitable access to educational opportunity is far from ideal. Those who most need that opportunity may, as a result of where they live, their lower income, their wealth, or their gender, may be those least able to access it unless, and we'll consider this later, governments and institutions allocate sufficient funding to make it free or genuinely affordable. And the importance of this is only highlighted by global demographic factors, which is the second point I want to make in this part of the lecture. Put simply, we are getting older. In 1980, the proportion of the world's population aged 60 plus was 8.5%. By 2030, this will have doubled to 16.5%, and by 2050 to 21.3%. The number of people aged 65 years or older worldwide is expected to increase by more than 100% by 2050 to 1.6 billion. And an aging population is the result, of course, of a fundamental demographic transition, combination of longer lives, a falling global birth rate, and smaller families. There are and will be a smaller proportion of younger people and a higher proportion of working age adults and of older people needing care and support. But that transition, of course, is not equally distributed. As between global regions, Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa are seeing some of the fastest growth in absolute number of older people. And as we've seen, those are some of the poorer regions and where there is a significant disparity in income and wealth. And this demographic shift is relevant to our concerns because those in this increasingly older segment of the population will either be working for longer because they want to or because they have to, or will need economic and social support from those who are younger, either because they are unable to work or because countries lack sufficient economic resource to allocate to their care. And as the World Social Report in 2023 put it, I think this is a good quotation here, high and rising levels of inequality threaten to become a defining feature of present and future generations due to a combination of acute crises and unfavorable long-term trends in employment and wages. Successive generations are increasingly unequal and economically insecure in both developed and developing countries, despite ongoing improvements in health and education. Without swift and bold policy action to counter this trend, future cohorts of older persons may be even more economically unequal than those alive today. Globally, as of 2015, it's a while back now, this stats, 30% of men and 15% of women aged 65 plus were active in the labour force. That was 17% and 9% of women in developed countries, compared with 38 and 18 in less developed countries, and 60% and 36% in the least developed, with the highest proportion in Africa. Now, where people are living longer, having to work longer, and where they may not have had educational opportunity earlier in life, there is an urgent need for sustainable redistribution of resource and to find ways of ensuring that older people are able to develop their knowledge and abilities in ways that will benefit them, their families, and their national economies. And it's not just those in middle age and beyond for whom upskilling or the provision of basic literacy and numeracy skills where those are lacking, which is important. This comes back actually to, to Yunlei's talk a bit, because we're talking about younger people. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, 57% of 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries, 57%, were suffering from learning poverty, which is defined as meaning that they were unable to read and understand a simple story. And in sub-Saharan Africa, that figure was 86%. The pandemic exacerbated this profoundly. According to a recent World Bank report, using data from PISA, which is the OECD's Programme for International Student Assessment, school closures and associated student learning losses during the pandemic resulted in scores in a sample of 175 million 15-year-olds from 72 countries, declining by an average of 14% of a standard deviation, or approximately 7 months of learning. Those losses weren't evenly distributed and were greater for students in schools closed for longer, for boys, for immigrants, and those otherwise disadvantaged. And that loss of education has not only delayed students' cognitive, social, and emotional development. The World Bank has estimated that it could translate to a 0.68 percentage point in global GDP growth, and that together these students could lose a combination of 21 trillion US dollars in earnings over their lifetimes, which is the equivalent of 17% of today's global GDP. And those statistics are staggering in themselves, but what's important for us here in this symposium is that, taken along with the economic inequalities and demographic transitions I outlined earlier, they emphasize the importance, the critical importance of finding ways to ensure that educational and training opportunities are prioritized in regional, national, and local political and institutional agendas. They are, if you like, at least some of the macro challenges the world currently faces, and in the context of which education throughout the life course, what we're concerned with, has to be situated. And now I want to just turn to some other more specific challenges in equitable access, ones associated with particular disadvantaged populations and educational delivery, before discussing how we might address those. As George Orwell famously put it in his book, Animal Farm, Junlei had Albert Einstein, I've got George Orwell. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And nowhere is the truth of that more visible than in the gap between the international legal instruments affirming the right to education without discrimination and the experience of those unable to take full advantage of that right. Many of you will be aware of the language in Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and perhaps in the Article 13 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And it's worth reminding ourselves of the general comment on the latter. Education is both a human right in itself and an indispensable means of realizing other human rights. As an empowerment right, education is the primary vehicle by which economically and socially marginalized adults and children can lift themselves out of poverty and obtain the means to participate fully in their communities. And that comment goes on to affirm that educational programs, while taking account of local conditions and contexts, should be available, accessible, acceptable, and adaptable, And as regards accessibility, it explains that this means education should be physically or virtually accessible, that it be affordable, and that it be accessible to everyone, especially to those most vulnerable groups, without discrimination on any of the standard prohibited grounds, which is to say race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. And there are, as these international instruments make clear, differences in the right to education depending on the stage a person is at in their educational development, with primary and secondary education having priority over tertiary and other opportunities, including adult education. And it's also recognised that the right, other than as regards the anti-discrimination provision, is one to be realised progressively, and that the different developmental stages of countries and their own specific economic circumstances may mean that what is provided for some may be more than for others at any one particular point in time. Nevertheless, enjoyment of the right is one that states party to the various treaties and conventions affirming the right to education must continuously strive towards. Now, as my earlier summary of the economic and demographic context suggests, ensuring equitable access, even for those who do not have protected characteristics, is challenging enough at the present time. But it's no less important, and arguably more so, to ensure that for these groups, many of whom have disadvantages which only access to educational opportunity can mitigate or ideally eliminate. And here I just want to focus on three groups: the forcibly displaced, women and girls, and those living in digital poverty. So let's take, for example, refugees, internally displaced persons and asylum seekers. At the current time, there are more than 110 million forcibly displaced fellow human beings on our planet. As the Incheon Declaration of 2016 affirms, member states should commit themselves to developing more inclusive, responsive, and resilient education systems to meet the needs of children, youth, and adults, including internally displaced persons and refugees. Recognizing that Sustainable Development Goal 4 can't be realized without this, it explains that education contributes to the development of the social and human capital of refugee communities, self-reliance and solutions, and also ensures that refugees have the basis for increased earning power and skills to rebuild their communities. So the Incheon Declaration highlighted a number of challenges that people in this situation face. Let me just check that that wasn't, yeah, that's right. Face. Many are detained for longer than is necessary, and in addition to the hostility and aggression they experience, often stoked by populist media, states may hold back on the allocation of dedicated financial resource to support their integration, an important component of which is inclusive education. Displacement caused by conflict has disrupted the lives of many in the past decade, with a catastrophic impact on the life chances of many. So, taking, for example, Syria, where universal primary education was achieved in 2000, quite an amazing achievement. The effect of the conflict there meant that in 2016, 16 years after that universal access had been achieved, only 60% of children were attending primary and lower secondary education, and over 2 million adolescent children were out of school. Worldwide in that year, just under half of all refugee children were not enrolled in primary school, and 4 out of 5 refugee adolescents between the ages of 15 and 17 were out of secondary school. Of course, the challenges faced by host nations, those who receive asylum seekers and refugees, are real. The demand will often outstrip supply, and the demand is often on low and middle income countries. It's quite often the neighboring poorer country that receives the vastest influx of those who are forcibly displaced. So 75% in 2023, according to the United Nations HCR. But even where there is supply, in other words, there is opportunity to provide education, there are administrative barriers such as a requirement to produce identity papers or certification of educational achievement. And where a person does have such certification, the absence of international or cross-border recognition of educational achievement can still prevent enrollment. Now, although we're not directly concerned with the education of children here, I think this is really important because it should be obvious that the provision of adult education is critically important as a response to this global refugee crisis, both for children and for adults. Just as we saw in relation to the terrible effects of the COVID pandemic on learning gain, forcible displacement means lost years of education, which can only be made up later in life. If we're to enable those children, along with their parents and their carers, to thrive, to have confidence, and to be productive members of their communities, whether in host nations or after returning to their countries or regions of origin, we have to find ways of securing access to educational opportunity for them throughout their lives. Turning now to women and girls, we've already seen how women across the world earn less than men, and that a higher percentage of women aged 65 plus are still having to work in low-income countries compared with those in middle and higher income ones. And those facts are, at least in part, an effect of the different experience of women and men in the early years of their education. UNICEF has estimated that globally, almost 130 million girls are not in school, including more than 30 million of primary school age. Although there is near parity of enrollment rates for boys and girls across all countries, fewer girls than boys complete primary education, and in low-income countries, only 1 in 5 complete secondary education. The disparity is much greater in countries affected by fragility, by conflict, and by violence. In those countries, girls are more than twice as likely to be out of school than boys, and at the secondary level are far more likely to be out of secondary school than those in countries not so affected. And when we remind ourselves that women make up half the world's population and that the contribution that all people have the right to make to their country's development, the national and social implications of this learning loss, as well as the impact on individual psycho-social development become clear. The fact is that everyone benefits from the education of girls. We know that women who are better educated know more about nutrition, about healthcare, that those who marry later, those who can and do have children tend to have fewer of them. They are more likely to be participants in formal labour markets, to earn more, and so to be able to make a more significant contribution to their country's economic development. Indeed, a 2018 study for the World Bank estimated that limited educational opportunities for girls and barriers to completing education cost countries between $15 trillion and $30 trillion in lost lifetime productivity and earnings. And there is, in short, a massively unrealized potential here. As far back as 1992, which is more than 3 decades ago now, the then chief economist of the World Bank, Larry Summers, said that investing in girls' education could be the highest return investment a developing country could make. Sadly, as the data which I've shared with you here show, there are many places across the world where the potential contribution that girls and the women they become can make has not been realized. We know that more educational attainment leads to higher earnings and better labour market outcomes, and these are being denied, often as the result of deeply entrenched cultural norms concerning gender and the appropriate role of women in society. And just as it is the case for children and younger people whose life chances and opportunities have been adversely affected by conflict and migration and by the lingering consequence of educational disruption caused by the pandemic, our obligation as adult educators should surely be, as far as possible, to address those structural disadvantages. And the third and last group I want to look at are rather different. They're not necessarily those impacted by conflict, by disease, or by the fact that they are women, though that could be confounding. They are those for whom access to educational opportunity is limited by their access to information and communication technology, or ICT. Adult education and lifelong learning take places in a variety of contexts and via a range of different modalities. It can be embedded within publicly or privately funded institutions of higher and further education, or through private sector providers of continuing professional development and training. It can be offered and experienced face-to-face, as we know, online or through hybrid delivery models. No doubt one of the biggest changes that we've seen in the way learners access educational opportunities over the last 2 decades, and massively amplified by the lockdowns imposed as a result of the pandemic, has been the increased use of the internet and mobile telephony, Worldwide, for example, the number of people accessing online learning platforms between 2019 and 2024 has increased from 428 million to 783 million, an increase of 83%. And the number of those accessing online university education increased from 13 to 31 million, an increase of almost 140%. Now, the increased popularity of this mode of accessing learning opportunities is, as we all know, a result of its convenience to those who have professional or other obligations and who need their learning to be delivered asynchronously at a time and in a location that works for them, and it increases choice, enables employers to deliver bespoke training and to support the development of sector-relevant knowledge and skills. And it can, for those who are not necessarily interested in formal qualifications or accreditation, be accessed relatively cheaply. And advances in tech and its pedagogical deployment, so through gamification, the use of VR and AI, have also meant that the experience of online learning has, in many cases, improved dramatically. And it all sounds like a win-win for those of us committed to promoting and securing access to learning across the life course, and for those of us privileged to live in countries that have affordable and widespread internet, Wi-Fi, 4 and 5G coverage. It surely is. But of course, this is not the case for vast swathes of the global population, and there are stark contrasts in affordability between advanced and developing economies and in access within countries. For example, according to data collated by the International Telecommunication Union and reported last year in 2023, in low-income countries, a 10-gigabyte data mobile subscription can take up to 25% of a person's monthly income. And the price gap between high and low-income countries for such a subscription is almost 100% greater than it is for a basic 2-gigabyte plan, which of course is hardly sufficient for accessing any content-rich learning resources. Although the ITU notes a global decrease in the cost of ICT services, an entry-level mobile broadband package costs more than 20 times more in a low-income country than it does in a high-income one on average. And a monthly data allowance of 10 gigabytes is more than 36 times the cost. And as the ITU notes, and as that slide shows, there continues to be a wide margin between high-income countries and others. Mobile broadband is more than 20 times less affordable in low-income countries, economies than in high-income ones, and a fixed broadband subscription where that's available costs the equivalent of a third of the average monthly income. And the challenge to equitable access created by this price barrier is compounded if you happen to live in a rural area where there is limited coverage or are a woman. So as we can see from these slides, although more people now live in urban than rural areas, and that transition happened around 2007, quite recently, there remain large parts of the world, predominantly lower middle income countries, where there remains a high proportion of rural inhabitants. While more than 80% of people in high-income countries live in urban areas, that's just over a third in low-income ones. And in rural areas, as the following graph and table show, these figures are reflected in internet use. So while 81% of those in urban areas were accessing the internet in 2023, only half in rural areas were. And while the gap between the two has been eliminated in Europe, it remains high in a number of lower income regions. In Africa, for example, 57% of urban inhabitants use the internet in 23, but only 23% in rural areas. And as for the gender divide, that's also stark and highlights the variation in educational and other opportunities available for women and men via the internet. Equitable access would mean what the ITU refers to as a gender parity score of between 0.98 and 1.02. And while the world taken as a whole has been moving in the direction of gender parity with a score of 0.92, however, because the parity score represents a ratio between percentages, it doesn't communicate the whole picture. So although women make up half the world's population, they represent a higher proportion of those not using the internet, outnumbering male non-internet users by 17%, which has been an increase of 6% in the last 5 years. And finally, we can see from the ITU's latest data, and it's only 24 plus. It makes us all feel very old when 24 plus is the older age group, right? use the internet compared with those who are younger, and that difference is marked more highly in low-income countries. So, it's a lot of material there, and I'm quite happy to share the slides, the data, and the lecture after it's finished. But I just want to summarize these key points before we go on to some solutions, which I'll go through quite quickly, and we can follow through in the masterclass and in any questions. So I explained why adult education and lifelong learning is so important. It provides individuals with the opportunity to develop themselves, to be engaged and informed members of their communities, and it provides the countries in which they live with a population empowered to make an active and productive contribution. And it provides the world with a population better informed about and better able to address the global challenges of our time. But I drew attention to the macro-level economic and demographic context, which showed how the provision of educational opportunity has to take place, but has to take place in a world where there are disparities in income and wealth and across the globe, the fact we're living longer, and that in many of the poorer regions of the world, people are having to work longer, and how the pandemic resulted in learning loss among a whole generation of children and younger people, disproportionately felt in low-income countries for whom the need for education and training to boost development is greatest. And finally, there I looked at areas of challenge at the global level, the disruption on the forcibly displaced, the significant and damaging differences in educational opportunity for girls compared to men and boys, and finally, the digital divide. Now, these are huge challenges, right? Global challenges. How on earth are we going to address them? Well, I think the first thing I need to emphasize is that my own experience, and perhaps the experience of many in this symposium, is of working in a high-income or relatively high-income country with established anti-discrimination and equalities legislation, widely and cheaply available internet, mobile coverage, and a diverse and relatively well-funded variety of institutions offering educational opportunities. So although there remain challenges as regards the support offered for refugees, perhaps, and asylum seekers, and gender equality in earnings and political representation are yet to be achieved, I work in a privileged environment. Locally, my university has a long-established and strategically important lifelong learning offer, and despite sharing in some of the financial and other challenges that all our universities in the UK are experiencing, we are well placed to weather those comparatively. And the point about saying that is when thinking about local solutions to global challenges, we need first of all to undertake a needs assessment. So this would include, for example, gathering data, being really clear about what the education and training needs of our local population are, segmenting that population where appropriate and determining what barriers exist based on their individual and group experience. What do they need? Such an assessment would involve working with essentially local community leaders and other interested parties and evaluating what gaps exist in local educational infrastructure. So I don't know whether you have this in the National University of Singapore, perhaps not as much as we have it in Oxford, but there are some projects we simply couldn't do in Oxford in our regional community because the university is not for us. It is not our institution. We have to have mediated organisations through which the university works, and we take a back step because we exist in a different social domain from the people who we believe we can allocate our resource to support. Secondly, there needs to be an active collaboration with stakeholders, developing sustainable partnerships with those whose expertise, resource, and relationship with those target groups can add value to our organisation's educational offer. So that will involve organising and supporting meeting events in the community, allowing those leaders and those they serve to plan and implement programmes to take an active part so as to ensure that what is being offered in fact meets their education and training needs. And in respect of those first two components of a solution-focused approach, I just want to share you with a local initiative in our department in Oxford. So this is my, that's not my department on the right, that would be quite nice. No, that's just the picture they always show that is Oxford. We've been working with an organisation for many years now called Asylum Welcome in our city, which is a charity which supports asylum seekers, refugees, and vulnerable migrants. So working with that charity, we're providing, through our department, free workshops in academic English, computing and maths in basic skills, and enabling those whose English is good enough to enrol for free on those of our open access courses where there are spaces when the enrolment deadline has passed for fee-paying students and there are spaces still, we just open up all of the remaining places in that class to people who are referred to us through asylum welcome. And the free workshop was made up by a grant of £20,000 from our university's diversity fund, and is a contribution towards the University of Sanctuary scheme, which is a national initiative for universities to make their resources available to those who come from this particularly vulnerable group. The third component in this solution, I think, is creating a local solution, is a curriculum that is adaptable, fit for standards, and embeds opportunities to engage with those global challenges of our time and to develop skills needed to participate in a rapidly changing environment. So far as adaptability is concerned, that means that ensuring that the delivery modes are ones that the target audience can take advantage of. This is really important, and I would just, 15 minutes left, yeah, thank you. So one of the things that's really important in Oxford, and I'm sure you have this in NUS, because everything has to be excellent in higher education now, everything has to be excellent. The sound system, the teaching, the outcomes, the student experience, everything needs to be excellent. Now, this is very challenging because if you're trying to create an online version of Oxford, which has been a face-to-face experience of small tutorials, working with professors in small groups, then there's a real issue for us in saying, right, the global version, the accessible version to the world needs to be very, very rich. It needs to be the most extraordinary version of what we do face-to-face. Now, that demands content-rich resource. And content-rich resource is bandwidth-heavy resource. And we're really struggling now. Well, actually, I don't think the rest of my university is yet struggling. They want to come up with stuff which would eat up some of the people in the Global South's data in about 5 nanoseconds. So how do we use streaming services, for example, like Netflix and other streaming services, to work in partnership with us, potentially, to deliver the content through potentially cheaper and broader ways, which we can add on or bolt on the learning associated with that, rather than embedding within Canvas or other, or Moodle or some other embedded site. And that is a real issue, because I think we at the moment have a mismatch between supply and demand and expectation, which we're going to have to address. Otherwise, we're just going to be producing the most extraordinary content for people who are never able to access it. So we need to think about, do our people have to travel long distances to a learning centre? And if they do, can they afford the travel costs of classes at a time that fit with work patterns or caring obligations? In my old university in Portsmouth, 2 universities ago, we were setting up a mobile bus that was going to go to supermarket car parks at a time when mothers were doing their shopping with their children, so that they could stop for a 15-minute class on languages while they had the kids, and just stop off for a cup of coffee and a little bit of learning, taking the learning to the places where the people were, rather than assuming they were going to come to the university and sit in the classroom, which was an alien environment and had nothing to do with their own social experience. So adaptability also means ensuring content that is culturally relevant and delivered by people sensitive to difference and alert to the importance of equality, diversity, and inclusivity. And as for global challenges, UNESCO has emphasized the importance of citizenship, education, and sustainability. Whatever the specific focus of adult educational and training programs and skills development are, providers like us have to be alert to and ensure the inclusion of opportunities to learn about topics such as poverty, gender, intergenerational solidarity, environmental protection, and climate change. And they should also, and this is included explicitly in SDG 4.7 as an expectation of signatories, enable learners to acquire through education the knowledge and skills, and I quote, to promote sustainable development, including gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity. The fourth element that needs to be included in any solution is evaluation. UNESCO, in its 5th report, has identified quality and quality assurance as critically important in the provision of education, but we're not always as good at that as we might be. Quoting the Belém framework agreement I mentioned earlier, it explains that ensuring quality requires relevant content and modes of delivery, learner-centered needs assessment, curricula that allow acquisition of multiple competencies and areas of knowledge, the professionalization of us, of educators, the enrichment of the learning environment, and the empowerment of individuals and communities. In my own department, we've addressed this recently by developing a clear curriculum statement against which the entirety of our portfolio of programs is being evaluated, allowing for local subject area statements, and by introducing digital badging and certification such as this. It doesn't show up the university crest on there, but this is blockchain secured now. We used to issue leaving certificates for our open access courses on PDFs that were printed out. People just you could just change the name and put another name there. Nobody knew who was getting what. That was before I started, I point out, but this is something we've introduced now. But this is great because this can go onto a LinkedIn profile. It means employers can actually know that what is being offered and what the person has done is something that was done by the University of Oxford. Fifth, those solutions have to be scalable. It's beneficial always to start, of course, with a pilot program that can be rapidly evaluated and adapted following learner and instructor feedback. And to think of all provision in a modular form so that it can follow a pathway, but in a way and at a pace that is manageable to the learner. I think we often have a we know best attitude, and sometimes I think we get that wrong. And finally, of course, we need to ensure that there's a supportive local policy environment. Leaders and practitioners of adult education should all feel confident to act as advocates for their work and ambitions. Presidents, vice-chancellors and deans of universities and schools of continuing education need to ensure that adult education is embedded in institutional strategy and ideally articulated in mission and vision statements and actively support it, as does our Vice-Chancellor. This is me with Irene Tracy, the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Oxford, who takes our department really, really seriously and always attends all of our awards ceremonies. And I think partnership is also very important. So I don't know how many of you are connected through ASEM. Is there anybody here who does the, yeah, a few? So the Cork conference in Ireland, it's a long way to go for a conference for a few days, but I hope to see some of you there, because that's when the Asian and European continuing education networks are getting together. And then, you know, those are just my own ideas, and I've got somebody standing there who wants me to stop so you can ask some questions, which is great. So I'm just going to end. There's an enormous amount of material here. I'm very conscious of that. But I did want to end with this. I haven't even really scratched the surface of the challenges we face or the solutions that we might implement. In whatever way we frame the former and approach the latter, it's important to remember that we are all involved in our own ways and in our own particular context in important work in the social contract for education. And this is this is the summary. I was quite pleased it came up with access as letters on the left-hand side. I thought that added up quite well. I couldn't get it to do equitable. That was too many things to add. But I did want to end with this quotation, which I thought was really important for all of us. Okay? So this is from UNESCO's Reimagining Our Futures Together. It says, the right to education as established in Article 26 of the Universal Declaration must continue to be the foundation of the new social contract for education and must be expanded to include the right to quality education throughout life. It must also encompass the right to information, culture, and science, as well as the right to access and contribute to the knowledge commons, the collective knowledge resources of humanity that have been accumulated over generations and are continuously transforming. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to talking more about some of the ideas here.
Thank you, Professor Weait. For now, we can begin the Q&A. Again, members of the audience can proceed to the aisle and ask Professor Weait any questions you may have.
Hi, thank you very much for the insightful talk.
Well, thank you very much for coming to ask a question.
Yes. I think my question is for that. You've outlined a sort of global space for the potential for adult education that definitely needs to be scalable and depends a lot on digital infrastructure and resources, and is very much framed by the context of every individual country and territory. And I think my question is, you've outlined a way that, for example, organizations and academic institutions like Oxford have certain tools and resources to help in this space. And what is your suggestion or vision for even places like Scale or these kinds of education centers and learning hubs in the global north, in developed countries like Singapore. What is your vision for how we can go even further to help this space, especially since a lot of the resources that are necessary are very context specific and also very based on digital infrastructure? Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think one of the things that is critical is we need, as universities, whatever, especially those of us who are working in universities which are relatively well-funded, well-respected, and have a tradition and support and history around this work, I think we need to work much more effectively and in a complementary way with the knowledge providers that are banging at our doors out there. I think Google, Microsoft, and their relationship with generative AI and what's happening in private sector skills and competency development and provision is going to fall on universities a bit like a ton of bricks unless we start working very, very carefully with them and strategically, because we are, as institutions, quite infrastructure expensive. We have this, for example, we have staff, we have energy costs, we have all of the material costs associated with the delivery of high quality education, which some of these platforms just simply don't have. They're working in an entirely different space. So I think what we need to do is incredibly quickly, if we're not already doing it, start thinking about what the additional value that strategic partnerships and alliances with those companies and organizations that have potentially more agility than we do, who can provide things that traditionally universities have not been that great at doing, where sometimes they've put their toes in the water and they've been burnt. Oxford, for example, famously, I think, before my time there, put its toes in the water of MOOCs and then pulled its toes out very, very quickly. It didn't work for Oxford's model. It works very well for some institutions, but not for others. So I think we need to develop strategic partnerships with each other and work out how we can. Just a very, very small example, if I may, if I've got time. I think it's very interesting how, if we think about universities, what we can offer, which some of those companies are not interested in doing, is core humanities stuff, philosophy, epistemology, really deep, hard thinking stuff that universities are very good at, history, English literature, criticism, music, all of those extraordinary things which are the result of human intellectual and creative development. Those subjects are ones which in many institutions are under threat. Languages are under threat significantly in the UK. I don't know whether they are quite so much here, but modern foreign languages in the UK universities are very, very much endangered. So one of the things we could do is we could work in partnership with each other where we have resource and where digital infrastructure enables us to engage with it, to have shared programs. Wouldn't it be extraordinary? Time zones are a bit of a problem. So some people might need to be up in the middle of the night and some people in the middle of the day to do these. But if you did it asynchronously, why can't the National University of Singapore and the University of Oxford, or possibly us and a less well-resourced university in a slightly different place, perhaps in southern Africa or Southern America, work together to cross-subsidize the provision of things which can be developed together for the local community needs, but using a shared resource, and understand, which was the point of that last quotation, the knowledge commons, because we're nothing if we don't find ways of sharing what we know. And we've got to find a way of doing that through and be less competitive. We need to be competitive in some respects because that's what our salaries depend on, attracting students who could go somewhere else. But I think that model is being so disrupted that nobody can know what's going to happen in 10, 15 years' time, and we need to think of diverse ways of engaging in partnerships, using the technology and our own histories to complement each other in the public and private sector.
Thanks a lot for the talk. I'm Andre from School of Public Health. I was wondering, because you highlight sort of the role of the well-resourced institutions, which are commonly in the global north, right? How do we make sure that we are not going in there and robbing the local communities of their own ways of thinking and doing things? And I guess that's a very relevant topic now, especially when we look at generative AI, because it has been fed with data from you know, the English language countries, and so we might actually reduce the richness of experiences and knowledge. Thanks.
Thank you. It's such an important question, and that idea about what's being scraped to produce the answers and local ways of seeing is obviously very important and very sensitive topic, and a very topical topic, of course, in the UK, which of course has a tradition, of course, of expropriating and appropriating other cultures for its own advantage, and we're very mindful of that. I think that this provides us with an opportunity for genuine reciprocity and payback, so long as what we do is, where we have the resource, we allow other people, where necessary, to tell the story that we need to support, and not take control of that. One very specific example, I was contacted about just before Christmas, in December time, by someone who said, I have to see you before I go back to Ghana on Friday. I run the equivalent of scale and my department at the National University of Ghana in Accra. And he came and told me that his department and his university was established by a lecturer from my department 50, 60 years ago, before independence. And I said, oh, well, how exciting, come. And he told me, I said, what's your relationship with Oxford? And he said, it's the mothership. I've never visited the mothership. And he was talking about how what Oxford had provided for pre-independent Ghana was the tools which gave, it's a complicated story, gave them the tools for independence through public administration, through language, through primary and early education. And their relationship with Oxford was not one of the colonial overlord, it was of interest, thanks, and wanting to find ways of sustaining and recognizing and honoring that history. And I said, fine, but you have to be the authors of the story. I think that's my summary. I think, yes, always work in partnership, but where you recognize where the power disparity is, allow those who are in positions of less eligibility, people who are less powerful, articulate the stories. It goes back nicely, I think, to the previous talk, where what you could see, what we noticed when we were invited to notice, it was that the people without formal authority or power were being acknowledged and noticed. And I think if we can do that attentively and understand what noticing really means, and active listening, which we do in a dialogue with our students, and attentiveness, but think of it as a structural level between institutions mindful of history, then I think we can do some very good work. But I think it is a really important dimension that we have to be mindful of. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Professor Weait.